There was one time I was in China, and my Chinese is not always so good, and so I've memorized some stories, some sermons that I preach, and when I'm preaching them in Chinese, I kind of know exactly which stories I can go to, and I know that my language can keep up with the story. And I was teaching from one of my favorite stories to teach in Chinese about the staff of Moses. And I talked about how God used that simple staff of Moses, that when Moses had doubt, God told him, lay that staff on the ground, and he did, and it became a serpent, and God said, I'll use that. And as I was sharing, I could see the Chinese group that I was sharing with, nobody was really getting it. I could see that their faces were a bit blank. I could see that many of them were looking at me with a bit of absence behind their eyes, as if they've never heard the story of Moses before. So I felt this is my opportunity to share maybe about something about Moses that they never heard before. So I talked about that staff, how God used that staff even when Moses was leading the people of Israel out into the promised land, and they got to the Red Sea, and he used the staff and stretched it out, how the waters split. And I could see the Chinese were still acting as if they've never heard that story before. And I felt good. I love when I'm able to share new stories. And I talked about how the Israelites were fighting against the armies of their enemies. And as Moses stretched out his hand with that staff, the enemy was being defeated. And after I was done speaking, I went and I sat down beside the pastor, and I was like, wow, this is pretty amazing, Pastor. It's almost like the people have never heard the story of Moses before. And he said, brother, the word for staff is zhang. You were using qiang, which means gun. They have heard the story of Moses before, but indeed, this is their very first time hearing the story of Moses and his gun. So I'm not always good at reading the room. But I love when I'm able to share at least something a little bit new. And as we talked today about end times and end time missions, last night I shared a little bit about needing the Spirit during the end times more than anything else. And this morning I shared about supernatural creativity in end time mission. And I don't know if anybody found a new revelation in that or not, but I did. By watching the Chinese, I got excited by being in the center of this new movement and having so many new ideas and concepts and transformation of my own beliefs. By being together with the Chinese, I have found myself in a place where, I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but when you're reading the Bible and you're reading something that you've read many times before, and all of a sudden you read it with new eyes, or you notice something you've never seen before. You've read something over and over and over again, but you've never seen it quite like this. And when you read it, it kind of jumps out of the pages at you. And when you see it, you get excited. And then you explain that excitement to someone else, and it doesn't seem as exciting as it was when you first read it. Have you ever had that? Where as it's coming out, you realize how common it sounds. And you're like, wait, it gets better. And you keep going, and it doesn't get better. But yet inside, that new revelation moves you to the core. It makes you shiver in the bones because it's something that you have never noticed about God before. And I don't know if you guys have ever thought about it before, but as I read the Bible and I read about the angels that all day, every day, stand before the throne and say, holy, holy, holy. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like one of the most boring existences I could think of. I mean, it might sound spiritual in a room like this, but if I had to do that versus Netflix, I don't know if I wanted to spend 24 hours for the rest of my life saying, holy, holy, holy. But then, one day, I heard a pastor explain it this way. He said, You know that excitement that you feel when you learn something new about God. And it's so exciting that all you can do is just groan. You try to think of words, but the language that you know fails you because it's not descriptive enough to talk about how excited you are to learn this one new thing about God. And he said, what if the angels, oftentimes we think that when we get to heaven, we'll know it all. But I don't know. I don't know that if you know everything about God, is he God? That there's something about the mystery that makes us excited. It's something about the mystery that makes us dive deeper and deeper into who he is and learn. And when we find these buried treasures, we get excited. What if the angels, they learn something new about God that's revealed to them for the first time, and language fails them, and all they can do is say, holy, holy, holy. And what if that on their way back up, God reveals something new to them, and again, all they can do is say, holy, holy, holy. And for eternity, they're just going through new revelations of how amazing God is. Lower your expectations if you think that I'm going to share anything that's going to be remotely that excitement and revealing a new thing about God. But it hasn't always been amazing serving together with the Underground House Church in China. You see, when I've written probably more about the Chinese underground church than almost anybody else alive. There's only one other person, and he and I are competing on who can write more about the history of China. And I intend to win. But as I've been writing over the years, one of the things I've written a lot about is persecution. One of the things I speak about a lot is persecution. One of the things I believe is promised to the church in end times is persecution. But the persecution that I often write about is that which comes from governments, entities, religious leaders that I expect to be persecuting Christians. One of the things that I have been challenged by while being on the mission field, which I believe is also a part of end time missions, and it's what I want to leave with you guys here today, is the persecution that sometimes comes from within. The persecution of being ostracized, kicked out, attacked by not individuals that you expect to attack you or kick you out, but by individuals that you might even look up to, that you might consider to be a hero of the faith, a pioneer of the gospel. You see, I met Brother Yun for the very first time in the 1990s. This amazing Chinese evangelist left from China, and I met him for the very first time in California. And in the 1990s, I remember as he was sharing about this idea of taking the gospel from China to all of the dark nations in between China and Jerusalem. I remember him sharing about this vision, and I got it too. I was bitten by the bug. It was contagious. I was a victim of the bite. And once I had the opportunity to go to China, I went. I was only supposed to stay for 8 months. 26 years later, they still haven't kicked me out. I'm still living and clinging onto China with this vision that I got from Brother Yun. But as I began to learn more and more about the Chinese underground church, I found leaders, pioneers, heroes of the faith that I admired. And then they began to say things that shook me to my core. If I can just read to you, shortly after I arrived in China, I began to study about a believer who I believe is probably one of the greatest teachers of God's word in Chinese history, at least that which I've studied. His name was Samuel Lamb. And I remember this great Samuel Lamb when I first heard him say this about Brother Yun, the man that I've been serving together with, the one who brought me to China, the one who shared the vision. When he said this, he was the most corrupt person in China. To the West, he claimed that he was a leader of over 58 million Christians in the underground churches in China. He was connected with the cult born-again sect. He's the most skillful con man in Chinese church history. That cut deep. I went and I met with Pastor Samuel Lamb. I discussed with him about this idea. But he wasn't alone. There was a pastor in Beijing, very well-known pastor. He wrote about back to Jerusalem. This is a Christian who is persecuted for his faith. This is a pastor who understands Chinese culture, nuances, language in a way that I never can or will. So if anybody knows anything about the Chinese underground church, surely it's this pastor in Beijing that I looked up to, and he wrote this. There is no biblical basis for the church in China to take up the baton of the Great Commission. There is no support for the church in China to, quote, finish the Great Commission. There's no historical evidence that the gospel traveled only in a westward direction, from Jerusalem to Europe to North America, then to China. And that by taking the gospel from China to Jerusalem, the Great Commission will be completed. No evidence. This was his writing. It was crushed. I don't know if you guys will ever find your place, or if you already have, where you find a new revelation about God and you're excited about it. And then someone that you consider to be a brother, a sister, a hero, a pioneer, ends up attacking you or someone that you love or a faith that you embrace. How do you deal with that? How do you answer that? How do you deal with that on the mission field? Because I believe the answer to that is a part of end-time missions. If we look at John chapter 9, I'm only going to look very briefly at John chapter 9. I won't spend too much time here. This is how I wanted to end this morning for the part that I'm speaking about, because as exciting as it is to talk about being led by the Spirit, as invigorating and exciting as it is to talk about end-time missions with supernatural creativity, this is something that goes to the heart of who we are as followers of Christ during end times. John chapter 9 provides an answer, I believe, because here we get to hear from the very first defender of the faith. If you want to see the very first act of apologetics being practiced in the Bible, it's here in John chapter 9. Here we see the very first effort. If you're not familiar with apologetics, it's basically just a Greek word that refers to defending of the faith. So here we see the very first kind of defender of the faith. This is the story of the blind man. If you're not familiar with this story, which I believe all of you are, this is the man that was born from the time that he was born blind. And Jesus heals him. And while he's walking around in his healing, the religious leaders that he no doubt looked up to, the religious leaders that he no doubt submitted to, as we see here, are questioning, how is it possible that you were healed? How is it possible that you were healed by a man who is a sinner? How is it possible that you were healed by a man who's a sinner on the Sabbath? This is work. This is bad. How can you call our God bad? John chapter 9, verse 24. I'm only going to look at two verses, verses 24 and 25. And my Bible might read a little bit different than yours, but it says this. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. I love that. When people ask you a question, then they give you the answer that they want you to give to them, and you do it for the glory of God. Read their response again. They say, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind, and they said, give glory to God by telling the truth. And what's the truth? Well, they tell him what's the truth. We know this man is a sinner. So all he has to do is repeat after them. But this man is a bit perplexed. He's a bit perplexed because he knows what Jesus did transformed his life. He knows what God did for him will change him forever. But when you get these very well-trained individuals that ask questions that are a bit complicated, you get tripped up in your answers. And he realizes that my answers don't sound right to them. The explanation that I'm given is not being accepted by them. So what can I do? And I think what he does is a message for all of us. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. The one thing I do know is I was blind, but now I see. When I look at the Back to Jerusalem vision, and I look at end-time prophecy, and I look at end-time missions, I don't require you to agree with me. I don't need you to confirm what God has given to me. I'm just sharing with you what God has revealed to me, and that may be good for you or it may be rejected by you. Either way, I know what I have experienced with God. You see, I felt called to China, not because I love the Chinese, because I never did. When I first moved to China, I thought that, I liked Chinese food until I moved to China. And I realized that not all Chinese food is Rice King or Panda Express. I didn't know how I was going to possibly learn the language, because even though English is the first language, my wife, who speaks 5 languages, would argue that I don't even speak the first one correctly. English isn't her first language or her second language. It's her third language. And when we were dating, she used to ask, how are people supposed to take you seriously if you speak like this? I used to joke that I would write love letters and she would send them back corrected. My language is not one that's meant for being in China. I didn't like the food. I didn't know the language. I didn't have a propensity to learn the language. I didn't like the government system. I was a bit confused with what was happening when I first arrived in China. You see, when I first arrived in China, I saw the Chinese praying for their government. I was a bit perplexed that why would you pray for the government that persecutes you? My culture, you fight the government that persecutes you. You pick up weapons and go against the government that persecutes you. At least march in the streets of Beijing. At the very least, write an angry social media post. But they prayed for their government in China. That was not easy for me. So in every way, I felt that I was not meant to be a Chinese missionary until I met other Chinese missionaries. And they let me know verbally I was not made to be a Chinese missionary. I was so unqualified compared to them. I never went to a Bible school before I first moved to China. I'd never gone through missiology training. I didn't know the Bible backwards and forwards. I was kind of a new believer. I had no business being a missionary in China. The confirmation of me being completely unqualified to be a missionary in China, came the day that I enrolled in a Chinese university to learn the language. Remember, I moved to a city called Kunming, and I went to the university. This was early 2000. And I remember getting to my very first class. I signed up for beginner's Chinese. I walked into my very first class, and none of the students were white. They were all Chinese. They had been born in another country like Thailand or Korea or Japan. And they all spoke Chinese as their mother language, but they wanted to learn the academic Mandarin Chinese. So I was already out of my depth in that class. Then I met my professor. She did not speak English. Whenever she would explain something, even on day one, if the class didn't understand, she would write the Chinese character, and the whole class would say, "Ah." Now I understand. I'm lost. I don't know the first thing. I thought there's a mistake. I signed up for beginner's Chinese, and they said, we have no other students for beginner's Chinese. It's either this class or nothing. So I quit. Very first day I quit. That was a Thursday. I remember it well. Friday, I went to sleep, and I had a dream. And in the dream, I began to speak Chinese. I began to understand Chinese. I began to read Chinese. I began to type Chinese. And that Monday, I went back to the school to see if they would still have me, and they did. And I was able to go through that course with advanced Chinese being supernaturally given to me. Now, I wish God would have just made me fluent from day one, but he didn't. I still had to work for it, but that first introductory level was all supernaturally downloaded, and I learned it in one dream in one night. And I found myself standing in the same shoes of this simple blind man that said, I don't know all of the answers of what you're asking. I can't tell you that I'm qualified. I can't tell you about lightning that came down and thunder that roared with my calling reverberating in my ear to let me know that I was called to come to China. All I know is I was blind and now I see. All I know is my own testimony of I couldn't speak Chinese before, but I can now, enough to be able to tell a story about Moses and his gun. When I look at the testimonies of the Chinese missionaries, I see a basic, raw element of end-time missions. So many times in the West, we get caught up that you have to go through all of these different trainings. You have to go through all of these different qualifications. You have to get all of these different diplomas. You have to be recognized by all these different entities and universities. But God is calling up a new generation that knows nothing more than I was blind and now I see. I can tell you what God has done in my life, and nobody can tell it the way that I can. I remember when I first heard the story, the testimony of one of the earliest pioneers of the Back to Jerusalem vision. In the early 2000s, we were doing humanitarian projects, and I was working directly with the government. And as I was working with the government, I found myself in a small town called Liupanshui in the western part of China. And this little coal mining town was where we decided to do several humanitarian projects of building schools, water sanitation, and hospitals. Now, during the early days of China, foreigners couldn't just go and live in any hotel that they wanted. They had to go to registered hotels. You see, the government needed to have you registered in a hotel that they approved because they needed to make sure that the room that you were staying in was properly laced with listening devices. And so when I arrived in Liupanshui, there was no hotel that would take me. None of them were registered. So the government had a bit of a situation. So they came up with a solution, and they said, we're going to have you stay at the hospital. So I lived at the hospital. And I probably was not the first foreigner to ever go to Liupanshui, but I was the first foreigner in a very, very long time. And so everybody in the hospital was kind of a little bit curious about this crazy looking foreigner that had just walked in. They didn't know if his foreignness was like a disease and could spread through the rest of the hospital. So they isolated me into my own room and kind of quarantined me off to a wing of the hospital. And I remember that so many people wanted to practice their English. They wanted to hear this foreigner speak. So they came into my room, and my room was full of nurses and doctors and hospital staff. And they surrounded my bedroom, and I was speaking. And if you don't know yet, I love to speak. 2 weeks ago, I was in China and I was preaching. I often preach for about 5 or 6 hours at a time. I won't preach 5 or 6 hours today, but I promise I'll make it feel like 5 or 6 hours. So I love speaking, so I began to speak. And I was sharing with the people there. And I felt the Holy Spirit say, talk about back to Jerusalem. And I thought, this is not the place. This is not appropriate. I can get in trouble. I can't share about the back to Jerusalem vision, not in this setting. But I felt it strongly. Share about back to Jerusalem. So I did. I started to share about this vision of the Chinese church, of taking the good news from China to all of the nations in between China and Jerusalem. Not just getting on a plane and flying to Jerusalem and selling knickknacks that are made in China in the streets of Jerusalem, but going from nation to nation, village to village, person to person. And as I shared, I noticed there was a woman in the back, tears in her eyes. She stands up and she said, young man, you don't know who I am, but I am the granddaughter of Pastor Jing. Pastor Jing was probably the most well-known pastor of the Back to Jerusalem vision. He had a vision of the church leaving from China and preaching the gospel all the way back to Jerusalem. He had the vision in 1921. And in 1921, she said, I remember my father and my grandfather sharing the very same vision that you are sharing today. She said, I remember as a little girl being upset, challenged, irate, that I was being punished because of the belief of my grandfather and my father. I was hurt because I never got to choose what I believed. And because of my father and because of my grandfather, I was considered to be an anti-revolutionary. And as an anti-revolutionary, my mother and I suffered. While my father and my grandfather were in prison for their faith, I didn't get to go to the right school. My mother did not get the iron rice bowl of communism where all of her needs were supposed to be met on a regular basis. We were cut off from all the resources of our area because we were family members of anti-revolutionaries. And she said, I remember as a little girl, I determined in myself at that time, I would do what the government wanted me to do. They didn't want me to share my faith, so I did not share my faith. They didn't want me to own a Bible, so I didn't own a Bible. They didn't want me to go to a church that was not registered. There was no registered church in my area, so I never went to church. I did what the government wanted me to do because I felt that would bring ease and comfort and prosperity for me in my life and my children afterwards. But here I am, she said. I'm 86 years old, and you come from a different nation. You come from a different culture. You speak a different language. You carry a different passport. You come from a different generation. And you are sharing the same testimony as my father and my grandfather. They might have killed my father. They might have killed my grandfather, but they could not kill the vision. I might be 86 years old, but I will not waste another day of my life. For as long as I am alive, I will continue to share the good news of Jesus Christ and share my story, my testimony. That testimony cannot be taken away. The testimony provides an answer, I believe, to doubt. The testimony also provides vision for the future, what God would have us to do. You see, the amazing thing about a testimony is that you can't orchestrate it. It's given to you. You are too small to make your own testimony. God gave it to you, and because it comes from God, it is eternal. Your testimony becomes the very thing that God uses through you uniquely. It is a unique story that God has given to you. It didn't start with you, and I would argue it does not end with you. Because God is eternal, the testimony He's given to you is also eternal. If you look at this testimony that God has given to you, sometimes we make the mistake of comparing our testimonies. And this, I think, is a heartbreak for God, because this is His intimate connection to you. This is the way that He is ministering through your life. It's an expression of your faith and your belief in Him because of what you have experienced with Him that no one can take away. We just came out with a book not too long ago. By the way, we brought several books here as a gift for you guys. I have spent most of my life writing testimonies of individuals that are a part of the Underground House Church. One of those books is a 30-day devotional. Each day is a different story and testimony of pastors, evangelists, and missionaries that I've had the privilege of serving together with. Each one of them that is in those stories, they have been persecuted for their faith. Many of them put in prison and put on death row because they refuse to remain silent. And that 30-day devotional, every day is a different missionary, pastor, evangelist that I sat down with. And they had gone through intense persecution. And I asked them, when you were going through the hardest time of your life, sitting in that prison cell, isolated, alone, you felt abandoned, when you were at a moment in your life when you begged God for death, what scripture did you cling to? Each one of them reveals their story, their testimony, and the scripture that God gave them to make it through the hardest time in their life that I think expresses God in a way that's very hard to find in today's literature. That book, I warn you, might ruin your life. You might sell everything and go to the mission field. I say that is a 30-day devotional for meat eaters. It'll put hair on your chest if you read that 30-day devotional. We have a few of those back there, but one of the devotionals that we did not bring with us is called Jihad, The Day I Died. It is a story about a guy that I've worked with for a couple of decades now that was the grandson of a well-known Ayatollah in Iran. He was brought up in the madrasa, trained to take over after his grandfather. He is the oldest grandson. And as he got older, he gave his life in jihad and he died. And he came back to life. And during that time, God started him on a journey where he became a believer in Jesus Christ. And because of that, he was put into prison, put onto death row, and was sitting on death row. And he told me, he said, I remember right before I was to be executed, for 2 years, they had done everything to him to torture him in some of the most gruesome ways that is very difficult to explain, even harder to read, almost impossible for me to write down as he's telling me the story, to capture the images, the suffering, the hardship that he went through. Not just physical torture, but mental anguish, where the guards wanted to show him that he's not a real man, so they raped him in order to humiliate him and break down his basic identity of who he was as a human being. He said, after 2 years, I clung to the cross. It was the only thing that I could do to keep me sane. But one day, just before I was to be executed, they brought me into the warden's office, and there, for the first time in 2 years, I came face to face with my mother. I hadn't seen her. She begged and pleaded for me to deny Christ and to say the Shahada, that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. She begged with me to stop putting her family and herself through all of this pain and hardship. His uncle said, please release him to us. It would be a shame for the government to kill him. He's brought so much shame on our family. Let him come with us. We want to kill him for dishonoring us. And he said he sat there and he watched how he let his mother down, how he disappointed her in every way, and he couldn't take it anymore. He said, Eugene, I went back to my cell that night. I had a piece of paper where I was supposed to sign the confession, and I made a deal with God. I said, God, I can no longer do this. I am prepared to deny you. I had a little cup that I could use for water. I had a little crumb that I was able to use for bread. And I took the paper and I made a cross, and he showed me this cross. On this cross was the date that he was going to take this communion. And he cried before God and said, God, I can't take it anymore. I'm done. I'm going to do one last communion with you. And then I'm going to walk into that warden's office and deny you. And he said just a flush, or the tides of sorrow and pain came on him. And he cried himself to sleep. The next morning he woke up saying, I can't deny Christ. The testimony of him being dead and coming back to life was stronger than anything that he had gone through in prison, any torture that he had suffered by the guards, even the shame of standing face to face with his mother, the testimony that he had. It wasn't some theological grasping of an idea that he was able to debate in Oxford because he held this idea and it was so strong and unshakable that it helped him keep his faith. It wasn't some idea that was true because he was able to prove it mathematically or scientifically or theologically. It was his testimony. I don't know why I'm going through this. I don't know why it feels like you've abandoned me. I don't know why I feel alone. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And it was the testimony that helped him continue on. I get to hear these stories over and over on the mission field. I'm reminded of, has anybody here ever heard of the great preacher E.V. Hill? If you've never heard of E.V. Hill, I would encourage you to go onto YouTube and go through these old classic teachings. E.V. Hill is one of my great inspirations, an amazing speaker from 30, 40 years ago. And he tells a story that I'll never forget. It's called When God Was at His Greatest. He says, if you look at the story of the Bible, you can argue, when was God at his greatest? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There you see the greatness of God on full display. How he created everything in perfect balance, from the insects to the animals to the floral to the planets, the earth itself being 93 million miles away from the sun. Any closer we would burn up, any further away we would freeze to death. Not even the moon revolves in vain, but it controls the ocean waves. And the ocean waves by God himself being given boundaries in his creativity. It was the moment of greatness when the greatest creator ever is exploding with creation and is creating a creation that creates. But that's not when God was at his greatest. E.V. Hill says, we see the great God come down on a people that rejected him. We see a great God that begins to show love, mercy, and deliverance to a generation, to a nation, as they have been enslaved for hundreds of years under the strongest empire of the day. We see a God show up to his people and deliver them out of slavery, leads them by day in a cloud, leads them by night with fire. And when they arrive at the oceans and they cannot escape from the immediate attack of their enemies and the almost certain death, God shows up and has water stack up like pillars on each side and dry ground under their feet as they walk through. This is when we see God at his greatest, when his people are hungry and he rains down manna from heaven. When they're thirsty and he brings forth water from a rock. This is when God was at his greatest. But he gets even greater because there was a moment on Calvary. No pastor can preach without first going through Calvary. And on Calvary, God takes the sins of those that hate him and those that don't even know him up on him and shows unending love, unending mercy. We see a God at his greatest as he gives himself as a living sacrifice to his creation. Think about this. We are his creation, which means if he doesn't like it, he could just destroy it and start all over again, make it better than it was before. But he doesn't. He submits himself to his creation and gives his life out of love, mercy in a way that has never been done before. But that's maybe not when God was at his greatest. E.V. Hill goes on to say, then it wasn't just what happened on the crucifixion, on Calvary, on Friday, but something amazing began to happen on Sunday. When the chains of death were broken, when the world could no longer hold us bondage because we have salvation through Christ. But that's still not maybe when Jesus was at his greatest. That's not when God was at his best. E.V. Hill said, I wasn't there when God created the world. I wasn't there when he put the planets into order, when he told the ocean that this will be your border and you go no further. I wasn't there when God delivered the Jews from slavery and split the Red Sea and fed them and gave them water to drink. I wasn't there when he died on Calvary. But I was there. At 9 years old, and I fell on my face, and I gave my life to him, and he spoke to me clearly and said that I am his child. That is my testimony that no one can take away. I can't speak on behalf of those other events, but I can speak on what happened to me. That's when God was at his greatest. That is a testimony that cannot be taken away from you. It is that testimony that we have that God brings us through the hardships. And I believe it is essential for end time missions. For us to go through end time missions, we need to have our testimony. But here's the thing about testimonies. Testimonies are going to make you a misfit. It's going to make you an oddball. It's going to make you not fit in. If we can go back to the book of John and just go down a few verses lower. we see that in John, hang on here. My Bible is misfunctioning. Can I see your Bible? John chapter 9, when he is making his argument, we come down to John chapter 9, verse 20. 30. 20, 30. We come down to verse 30. It says, when the Pharisees continued to ask their questions, how did he respond? The blind man said this. The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. Nobody's ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could not do nothing." He could do nothing. He could not do nothing. Yeah. And he replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? Who are you to tell us? You are a sinner from birth. We are the Pharisees. We are the teachers. We are the leaders. We are the deciders." And I love what happens next. And they threw him out. Verse 35. Jesus could have come to the rescue, defended this blind man, stood in front of him to the Pharisees and answered the Pharisees, but he allowed this man to share in front of the Pharisees and re-engaged him only once he'd been kicked out. Verse 34, and they threw him out. Verse 35, and I love this. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and he found him. Jesus gives us a testimony, and that testimony makes us a misfit. And that misfit, I believe, makes us perfectly qualified to carry out the great commission of Jesus Christ, the very thing that he has called us to do. He has given you a testimony to do it. And when everybody else rejects you, rejects your testimony, that's when God can use you, because you're not relying on the structures. You're not relying on the leaders. You're not relying on the stable infrastructures of your day and age, but putting all of your trust in him. All I know is I was once blind, but now I see. I want to thank you guys so much for allowing me, a fellow misfit, to come and join you in this weekend of talking about missions with Flame International. I pray that the testimony that God has given to you that makes you unfit for this world brings you in perfect coordination with other misfits to complete the Great Commission. I don't know if you like being called a misfit, Jan. But my misfit connects with your misfit. And I thank you so much for this opportunity. God bless you guys.
Stay here, man. Yeah.